My name is Delvin F. Smith, and I'm a patient in room 431 of the Nan Travis Memorial Hospital in Jacksonville, Texas. The date is October the 25th, 1977, and I was entered as a patient 2 days ago in intensive care as a heart patient. This is my third heart attack, and I propose, while I'm recuperating from this one in this private room, to try to tell some of the story of my life and put it on tape. Since I'm sometimes a little badly disorganized, this story may skip back from the past to the present and back and forth quite a bit, but I'll try to keep it fairly interesting to at least members of my family and my grandchildren. I was born on May the 8th, 1919 in Mangum, Oklahoma. I am the oldest living son of Oscar and Edna Smith. I had an older brother named Gerald who died as an infant at age 3 weeks. As I said, I'm the oldest living son. I'm the oldest of 4 living children. Next was my sister Velma. Next is Bruce. And next was the youngest, J.F. Smith. My father was the oldest living son of J.F. and Maggie Smith. My grandfather, J.F., was named Jacob Franklin. My grandmother was Maggie Garrison. My dad had several brothers. Earl was next to him, then Bernard, then Mel, and then Virgil, and Allie, his only living sister. He had one sister, little Dolly, as he refers to her, who died as an infant. He had an older brother, Charlie, who died at the age of 12 years old of tetanus. The story of my grandfather has been told many times, but I'll repeat it briefly here. His father, Andrew Jackson Smith, and his mother moved from the neighborhood of Chuckey, Tennessee, to Texas in the late 1800s. While living in Ennis, Texas, my great-grandmother died, and my great-grandfather, Andrew, with his other children, went back to Tennessee, leaving my grandfather, Jacob Franklin, in Texas. It's my understanding that he was about 12 years old at the time he was left in Texas, but I'm not sure of this. This information comes from Virgil Smith. Anyway, when my grandfather got back to Tennessee, he married a first cousin of his deceased wife and raised a second family. His first family consisted of my grandfather, Jacob Franklin Smith, Bob Smith, and Charlie Smith, and my Aunt Sarah, who married a Garrison. The second family of my great-grandfather then consisted of Tom Smith, Cordy Smith, and John Smith. Tom Smith disappeared in 1915 and has never been heard from since that time. He was last known of in Globe, Arizona, and I have seen marriage records showing that he married in the year 1915 in the courthouse in Globe, Arizona. My mother was Sarah Edna Hatchett Smith. She was the second oldest daughter of J.F. Hatchett and my grandmother, whom I never knew, and she died in 1918 before I was born. My mother was one of 8 children who lived to maturity, they being the oldest, Jess Hatchett, the oldest girl, Emma Hatchett, and then my Uncle Brown Hatchett, and my Uncle Fred Hatchett, and my Uncle Orland Hatchett, and my Aunt Vera, and my Aunt Addie, as well as Aunt Emma. Of these 8 children, the only 2 living now are my Aunt Emma and my Uncle Jess, who both at this time reside in the Cordell Christian Home, which is an old folks home in Cordell, Oklahoma. Statement was slightly incorrect, as my Aunt Addie, mother's youngest sister, was alive at the time that statement was made. I'm not sure, but I believe my dad might have died in 1973 rather than 72. My father was a school teacher during all the years I lived at home. My earliest remembrance was at a place called Prairie Hill, Oklahoma, which is in Jackson County, between Duke and Audacity, near Altus, which is the county seat. My sister Velma was born near El Dorado, Oklahoma, which is also in Jackson County and not far from Prairie Hill. My dad taught school at Prairie Hill for 4 years. However, there was a 2-year span of teaching, then 1 year of being absent from Prairie Hill, and then coming back and teaching for 2 more years. The last year he taught in Prairie Hill was the first year I attended school, which was in 1925, and I was in the first grade in Prairie Hill, Oklahoma. My brother Bruce was born during the year my father was away from Prairie Hill, in between his 2 sessions there, and I can remember the time when my brother Bruce was born. We lived at a place that I believe was called Stony Point, and I don't know what Dad was doing there, or I just remember very vaguely the time Bruce was born, and that Velma and I were taken to stay with Joe and Eula Chadwick. The Chadwicks were friends of my parents, and Eula Chadwick had been a teacher at the Prairie Hill School, and Joe Chadwick was a farmer. And his father, Will Chadwick, was also a fast friend of my father's. My brother J.F. then was born during the last year that we lived at Prairie Hill, shortly before we moved to Humphrey, and I can remember his birth also. If I'm not mistaken, the same doctor delivered my mother for all 4 of us children. I know that the same doctor was used for myself and for Bruce and for JF, but I'm not real sure whether he came to El Dorado and delivered Velma or not. This doctor's name was Dr. Mabry, which have lasted on through life up until this time. One of these fast friends was Sigurd Hovey, whose parents had come over from Norway and lived in the Prairie Hill community, and Sigurd and Red and his sister Gertrude were students of my father's at Prairie Hill, and I believe Red Hovey played on the basketball team, which Dad coached. Another family that we first met at Prairie Hill were the Green family. Mr. Green was R.P. Green. Mr. and Ms. Green had 2 sons, Albert and Audrey, and 1 daughter, Georgia. They moved away from Prairie Hill and moved to West Texas to a community called Fielton. And in 1928, they built a new schoolhouse at Fielton, and Mr. Green was elected to the school board of the new school, and having been very friendly with my father and the Prairie Hill community, he contacted Dad, who was at that time at Hedrick, Oklahoma, and persuaded him to come to Fielton in West Texas and be the first superintendent of the Fielton school. So the Green family has also been fast friends of ours from up to this time. However, at this time, the Mr. and Ms. Green are both dead, and Audrey and Georgia are both dead, and Albert, the oldest son, is the only one living. He lives in Arlington, Texas, and we see him fairly frequently and are still fast friends. A short time before my father died, Mrs. Green had died in Portales, New Mexico. Attended her funeral and saw Audrey Green for the first time in many years, since about World War II, at the funeral. I persuaded him to come to Lubbock and spend some time with us, and we got in my car. He had flown out from Portland, Oregon, where he lived. And we got in my car and went back to Fielton and went over some territory where we were both lived as younger men, and we even liberated two or three old school desks from the old Fielton School, which has not had school in it now for some 25 years. And I have a couple of these in my garage in Lubbock now. They're the same desks, incidentally, that were brought into the school when it was new in 1928, and I also have two folding chairs which came from the old schoolhouse, which my dad bought when the school bought folding chairs. Anyway, as I said, Audrey had come to Lubbock and visit me shortly after his mother's funeral, and after we'd visited around in West Texas, we traveled to Oklahoma and visited my parents, and it was there that we found my dad was sick, and I made arrangements for him to go back to Lubbock with me after I'd been to Dallas and taken Audrey down there to Arlington to Albert's place, and I took Dad back to Lubbock with me, and having made arrangements for him to see Dr. Bridwell, and before the time for the appointment came, he entered the hospital, and he never recovered from the exploratory surgery. Although he died in Lubbock, we took him back to Cordell to bury him. I'd like to come back to the present for a little bit now. The telephone you heard ring just a minute ago was a long-distance phone call from Dolores Carter, who is one of our church members in Lubbock, Texas. She was calling to inquire about my health and see how I was doing, and to let me know that the people in Lubbock were still concerned about me and were still praying for me. But we've talked enough about death for this little bit. I still feel like I have many years to live, so let's talk about some things that have happened in the past and maybe will happen in the future. As I stated before, when we moved away from Prairie Hill, we moved to Humphrey, Oklahoma, stayed 1 year, and then to Hedrick, Oklahoma, stayed 1 year there, and then came out to Fielton, Texas, where Mr. Green had persuaded Dad to come and be the first superintendent of the new school there. It was at Fielton that my mother became ill. She had suffered from asthma from the time we got to West Texas until she died. And from the time we got to West Texas, it seemed like from then on until the end of her life, she was never in really good health, although she outlived my father by 3 or 4 years. We lived at Fielton for 2 years, and it was while living here that the Great Depression started. The stock market broke, and then we moved to Amherst, Texas, and lived there for 2 years, where my father was a principal of the high school. This was the only time during my years at home that Dad was not the superintendent of the school he taught in, but he was only the principal of the high school there, and a man by the name of Mr. Fagla was the superintendent. Mr. P.H. Doolittle was the superintendent of the grade school, and they became fast friends and remained so for the remainder of their lives and Dad's life. Times really got hard in Amherst. The Depression grew and grew and continued to go worse. Dad had an old Dodge automobile, 1926 model. This is the one I learned to drive in. While living at Fielton, he had decided he'd try to get into farming and had purchased a quarter section of land up near Flagg, Texas, which is not too far from Dimmitt. He and another teacher there, Colonel Dodson, Spec Dodson, bought this half section in partnerships. Each had a quarter. They made one fair corn crop and didn't get anything for it. Made one good wheat crop and sold it for 25 cents a bushel. Some of it went for as low as 19 cents. This was in the worst of the Depression years, and at the end of 2 years, it became time for Dad to leave Amherst, Texas. He worked out a deal where he traded schools with a fellow who was at Bovina, Texas, and Dad moved to Bovina to become superintendent of schools there, and he stayed there for the next 4 years. It was at Amherst that I got out of grade school, and my first year in Bovina was my first year in high school. My last year there was my last year in high school. We lived in Bovina 4 years, and up to this time in my life, that's set a new record of having lived in one place 4 consecutive years. Incidentally, that record stood until 1963, when I had been back in Lubbock 4 years from Jacksonville, Florida, and continued in Lubbock until '69. The Depression years in Bovina were bad, but of course, for us children, myself and Velma and Bruce and Jay, we didn't know it was any different from normal times. We knew that we never seemed to have any money for anything. We never had any money, period. I wonder now how my dad kept in his right mind and made ends meet. He, 1 year at Bovina, or maybe 2 years, he taught for as little as $1,600 a year, and only half of that was received in negotiable warrants. The other half being given to him in what they call B warrants, which in order to get any money on them, you had to take them to the bank and discount them. While we were at Amherst, this old 1926 Dodge my dad had quit running, and he got Albert Green, the friend I've told you about before, to take his 1929 or 30 model Chevrolet, using the tires off of Dad's old Dodge and Albert's Chevrolet. Albert took Dad around trying to locate a school and a place to go, and that's the way he located the place at Bovina. While we were at Bovina, Dad bought an old Whippet, 1928 model Whippet, 6-cylinder. Most of them were 4-cylinders, but this one was 6. Had a timing chain on it, which was bad about jumping out of gear. And we kept it until Dad finally traded some of these B warrants I've told you about for a 1931 model second-hand Chevrolet. And this is the car he kept until 1935, when he finally managed to be able to buy a new car from the dealer in Clovis, New Mexico. We were still living in Bovina. As I look back on my high school years, they're pleasant years, although I wonder now how we got along without some of the things that we consider necessities today, which would have been considered pure luxuries at that time. We had our second radio when we lived at Bovina, and it was quite a thing to be able to sit and listen to the radio programs for entertainment. The children these days feel like they have to have colored TV. But that old Philco radio was pretty good back in those days. Listen to Amos and Andy and Fibber McGee and Molly and Jack Benny and George Burns and Gracie Allen, and some of those old shows, which were pretty good. Incidentally, I have a record with some of those shows on them that my brother JF gave to me a few years ago, which I treasure very highly. The price of things back in those Depression days would be unbelievable to people now. Hamburgers were 10 cents, 2 for 15, sometimes 4 or 5 for a quarter. Cigarettes, Camels or Lucky Strikes, 15 cents a pack, 2 for a quarter, or wings were 10 cents a pack. Although most of us smoked Bull Durham, that's what I learned to smoke on, Bull Durham and Prince Albert Rolled. And I must confess that I started smoking at an earlier age and quit in 1968 when I had my first heart attack. I became such a heavy smoker that I thought for a while I couldn't quit, and in fact for a time I couldn't have. When I had my heart attack, it became a necessity, and actually wasn't any trouble for me to quit at that time. I guess the good Lord helped me. But we were talking about the prices of things. You could buy a good pair of blue jeans back then for 69 cents, blue chambray shirts for 25 cents, a suit of clothes for $14.95, J.C. Penney's. Best in J.C. Penney had for $19.75, even up into 1938 and 39 and 40. That's quite a lot of difference in what the price of clothes are today. Reasonably good suit, one about the quality you used to get for $29.75, and right after World War II, it cost you about $150 today. Best suits go on up to $300 and $400. I mean the best ones in Lubbock. I paid $16 the other day for a pair of Levi cotton trousers. Might have been half polyester and half cotton. $44 for a pair of Seconds boots, $50 for a pair of shoes. So prices are pretty high now. When I worked for JCPenney in Clovis, New Mexico, the best shoe they sold for men was $5.90. Today they don't even have one that good. It costs you now about $1.50 to get a good hamburger with everything on it. A pound of bacon costs around $2. And I guess the quickest change has been in the price of real estate. Back when my wife and I first lived in Clovis, New Mexico, we rented a house made of adobe, but it was a stucco house, and a pretty nice house to live in, made into a duplex apartment. For a while we rented the whole house for $10 a month, then rented out half of it for $20. The house I live in now has a market value of about $40,000 to $45,000. I bought it in 1970 for $17,800. It's just been going up ever since. I don't know how in the world I could pay for it if it wasn't already paid for. And yet I feel like that there'll be people listening to this tape in years to come that will feel like the prices I'm quoting as in effect today are very, very dirt cheap. And the prices I quoted as back during the Depression were just unbelievable. Automobiles. We talked about Dad's old Dodge. Dad bought a brand new Model T Ford in 1925, and I think he paid $500 for it right in that neighborhood, maybe $475. The only other new car he bought was a Chevrolet bought in 1935, and I think he might have paid $900 for it. Maybe $1,000, but $900 would be closer to it, I'm sure. I just bought a new car this year. It's a Chevrolet Suburban. It's a station wagon body on a pickup chassis. Got everything on it, air conditioning, automatic transmission, the whole works. Sticker price on it, just a little over $10,000. Yet they're selling more cars today than they ever have in history. But I've deviated a little. I left us in Bovina, Texas. We lived there 4 years. And when I graduated out of high school, I believe I've stated before, I went back to Kansas and spent the summer with my grandmother and grandfather and my Uncle Mel working in the wheat harvest. I sort of had a little hankering to go to college, but there wasn't any money to do it with, and I was kind of a timid country boy anyway. So I decided I wouldn't go. I thought then, and I think now, that I should have been a lawyer. People say I've got a stubborn streak in me, just stubborn enough not to give up an argument easily. I have a certain amount of logic that I'm able to use, and I think I could have made a lawyer. But that's neither here nor there. After I left home in Bovina, incidentally, I had an old Model T Ford when we lived in Bovina. I used it to haul water with. We lived in a house in Bovina that my dad rented for nearly 4 years that didn't have any water on the place at all. All the water we used for the family had to be hauled from the schoolhouse, which is a couple of blocks away. And he bought an old Model T Ford, and it was my job to keep water hauled for the house and the washing and the bath water and for the livestock too. We always had a cow and a hog. Milked the cow, and we butchered hogs every fall for meat. Up until the time I graduated from high school, it had been only 1 year in my entire life that I lived in a house that had a bathroom in it. That was for 1 year at Amherst. But when I left home to go to Kansas after I'd graduated from high school and worked in the wheat harvest, I started home again at the end of the summer. And in the meantime, my parents had moved from Bovina to McAdoo, Texas, where my dad was superintendent of the schools there. He had made a trade with Mr. Cherry, who was the superintendent at McAdoo, and had traded places with Mr. Cherry. So Dad went to McAdoo, and Mr. Cherry went to Bovina, where he stayed for several years. I think it must be obvious to anyone listening to this tape that I'm feeling better today than I was yesterday. A doctor just came by a little while ago and told me I could get out of the hospital tomorrow. I'd have to stay around here in Jacksonville, Texas, for a few days and rest, and then I could ride home in the car I talked about buying a while ago. Wayne is going to drive us home and fly back then to Tyler. As I said before, when I came home from the wheat harvest that summer that I'd graduated from high school, my parents had moved to McAdoo, Texas. The first Sunday I was at home, I went with my parents to church, which we always did when I was at home. And I met a young lady of the community named Aubrey Faye Jones. among several other young ladies. Barbara Fay was the one that took my eye, and I kind of liked her looks, and I guess the feeling must have been mutual, because from that meeting I was introduced to her by my mother. Our marriage developed. We were married in Lubbock, Texas in 1938 on June the 9th, but there's a lot of ground to cover between now and then, so I'll just make brief mention of it at this time. I might recommend here, though, that church is a pretty good place to go. Some very, very, very fine things have happened to me at church. For one thing, I found my Lord Jesus Christ in the church. I was baptized when I was about 9 or 10 years old and lived in Fieldston, Texas. A preacher by the name of Kirchable, Oscar Kirchable, baptized me. I was baptized in Henry Pickrell's horse tank because the churches didn't have baptistries in them in those days. I've met many, many good lifetime friends in church. And as I said a while ago, I met my wife in church. The church is the center of our life in Lubbock now since I've been retired, and I just don't know what I'd do without it. I think the Lord showed a lot of wisdom when He created the church, and He created the church for man and for man's own good. If you stop and think about it, there's nothing you can do to help the Lord. He's able to do anything He wants to for Himself or anybody else. He's all-powerful. But all you do is to help yourself. If you follow what the Bible says, you'll be helping yourself. Some people seem to take the attitude that they're doing God a favor when they go to church, or they're doing God a favor when they worship Him, but God's doing them a favor to give them the opportunities that they have. I just throw that in for what it's worth and don't charge anything extra for it. But we were talking about me coming back and meeting my wife at McAdoo, Texas. I planned to go to Lubbock and get a job and work in Lubbock, but before I did, my dad had a very serious car wreck, which broke his kneecap in 6 pieces and shattered it pretty badly, and incapacitated him for about 6 weeks. And so I stayed at home and milked the cow and kind of did what I could to assist around the house and take Dad's place as best I could. Mr. Hubert Butts, who taught school at McAdoo and had taught Dad at Bovina, was very good about filling his place in school. And after Dad recovered from this knee injury enough to get around, I did go to Lubbock and secured a job with S.H. Cress and Company as a stock boy and window trimmer trainee. I worked for them 2 years. So that fall in 1936, I became a citizen of Lubbock, Texas for the first time. Talking about prices again, I lived in a boarding house with the landlady's name was Mrs. Dresser. It was at 9th or 10th Street. I can't remember which, but I believe it was 9th Street and Avenue Q. I lived in I had a room in a basement with a roommate named Barney Thompson, I believe. And my room and board cost me the whole big sum of $3.50 a week. Now, I can't say that we ate the best food in the world, but we ate staple foods, good foods, and it filled us up. And this was a good enough place for a 17-year-old boy to sleep. Not as good as I'd ever known, so I didn't miss any difference. At least they had a bathroom in the house. Well, shortly after coming to Lubbock, going to work for Cress's, I went to church at the Broadway Church of Christ, which at that time was at the corner of Avenue M and Broadway. And who should I meet on the church house steps but that same little girl from McAdoo that I'd liked the looks of so well, named Barbara Fay Jones. She'd come to Lubbock to go to college. She got out of high school the same year that I had. So I made my first date with her, and we started going together. I hadn't got too serious about her, and was taking her rather casually until Valentine's Day come, and I got a nice little Valentine from her in the mail. So I didn't do anything but go down to the store and buy a box of candy and Valentine candy and take it out to her. And that was the start of a courtship that's still going on. She was a good girl, she's a good woman, she's been a good wife, and she's a good mother to our children. That's one more reason why you should always go to church. You might meet your future mate there. And I can't think of a better place to find one. I think I'll take a little time now and bring you up to date on what our family does consist of. Our oldest son is Vance, who lives in Buena Park, California. His wife is Charlene. Their oldest daughter is Michelle, who will be 16 in November. And next is Jason, who will be 11 or 12. I'm not sure which in November. And the next is Allison, who is about 8 years old. Then we have our daughter Delvin, who is married to Louis Moncrief, who is a college professor at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. They live on a farm at Haslett, Michigan, and Louis commutes each day to his teaching job at the college. They have 4 children, the oldest 2 of which are adopted. The oldest is Whit Moncrief Jr. He's named after Louis. The next is Lori Lynn. The next is Ethan Daniel. And the last one is Amy. Then our youngest son, Wayne, who lives here in Jacksonville, Texas, has 2 sons. His wife is Sharon. His 2 boys are Rex and Troy. Rex is 7 years old and Troy is about 4 years old. This will be continued on the other side of this tape. Don't give up yet, it'll start in a minute. Well, it's been quite a while since I've worked on this tape. The date today is May the 6th, 1978. I'll be 59 years old in 2 more days. If I'm not mistaken, the other side of the tape carried us up to the time I moved to Lubbock and started to work for S.H. Crest and Company and started going with Arbor Fay. Back in those days, you worked from can till can't. They didn't have any 40-hour week that I know of. I went to work at 7:30 in the morning at Crest's. Got off about 6:30 or 7 in the afternoon, and usually an hour later came back, worked a couple 3 hours at night. At least 2 or 3 nights a week we did this, and we worked 6 days a week. We were open Monday through Saturday, and we worked Monday through Saturday. And instead of a 40-hour week, I think I probably averaged closer to a 60-hour week, but the pay was the same. We started off at $15 a week, and I believe after about a year and a half, I was making 16 or 17, and that's 17, I guess. And that's as much as Crest ever paid me. There were a lot of things different then and now. The girls who worked at the counter at Crest's in those days were paid $9 a week. And again, they never received any overtime if they worked over 40 hours. There wasn't any such thing as a 40-hour work week at that time. Today, anything over 40 hours is overtime at time and a half. That's the law. Anything over 48 is nearly unheard of. And if I'm not mistaken, the minimum wage is now around $2.65 an hour and going to $3 before too much longer. My job at Crest's was stock boy. I received the stock. The freight trucks would bring it to the alley. I'd put it on the freight elevator and either take it upstairs or downstairs. We had stock rooms upstairs and stock rooms downstairs. And I also learned to be a window trimmer. This was something that paid dividends for me a little later in life. I also learned to sweep floors and use the oil mop on them, and we did it all. There was a Negro porter named Ernest, who was a pretty good old boy. But we all pitched in at least once a month and helped him oil the floors upstairs. While I worked there, they put air conditioning in. The air conditioning in those days consisted of a big washed air unit on the roof. No refrigerated air anywhere except maybe in a theater once in a while. I think the Palace and the Lindsay Theater might have had refrigerated air conditioning at that time, but that's about the only places in town that I can think of that did. Back in those days, everybody came to town on a Saturday and stayed till late Saturday night.
and the store didn't close on Saturday night until 9 o'clock. And Broadway and Main Street in Lubbock were really crowded on Saturday and Saturday night. I think you could probably drive a truck sideways down Broadway on Saturday night now and not hit anything. And the old Crest store is vacant as far as I know. They've closed it up. They had a 99-year lease on it, but I guess they're still paying rent, but they're not operating there. In fact, they don't have a store in Lubbock now. Neither does Woolworths, and they were a block down the street. So I worked for S.H. Crest & Company for a little over a year. And as I've said before, I was going with Autobiography. My mother and father lived at McAdoo, where the dad taught school. I believe he was there 2 or 3 years, 2 years, I guess. The spring of the year came, though. I had a hard time staying at work. I got to wanderlust. I liked to travel. I'd always had an ambition to travel, and the only thing that kept me from traveling more in those days was the fact that I didn't have the money to travel on. Anyway, I quit Cressy's, and I don't even remember what time of the year it was now, but I think it must have been the spring of the second year I worked for them. And started looking for another job. And jobs was kind of hard to come by in those days. I tried a little bit of everything. I sold radios and vacuum cleaners and refrigerators, but I just didn't sell much. I had them for sale. I worked for a used car lot trying to sell cars, and I wasn't much better at that. Or maybe I was good and just didn't anyone have any money to buy them. I'm not sure which. I finally wound up working for Mr. J.A. Hodges, who had a hardware store right across the block on Avenue G, east of the post office, where the post office was at that time. He had a hardware store and a dry goods store in the same building, and most of his stuff in the dry goods store was things that he had accumulated over a period of years that were out of style. Nobody wanted them, and he had very few customers, but he hired me to run the dry goods side. Well, that was a pretty boring job because there wasn't much to do. There wasn't anybody to ever come in to buy. And he sat up there in that office, he and his wife, and watched you all day, so you had to look like you was busy, and that wasn't very easy. But anyway, I was working there when Autobiography and I decided that we'd get married. I think what brought it to a head, there was an ad in the paper wanting a couple to get married on the stage at the Palace Theater in Lubbock. And I used this as an excuse that we can't afford to wait no longer. Here's something free, so I talked to Autobiography and let's get married at that time. And we went to see the theater, and they agreed. And it just happened that the date worked out so that it was just a day or two after she got out of her second year at school at Tech. I'm not sure, but I think the fact that she was having such a hard time with zoology might have had something to do with marrying me, because she knew she wouldn't have to go back to school next year and take zoology again if she did. I had moved from Mrs. Dresser's boarding house to Mrs. Eklund's boarding house and lived there with her on 2 different occasions in 2 different locations. In fact, one place was over on Avenue K and one was on Avenue M, I believe, and right across the street from my nursing home. And then I also spent quite a bit of time at Mrs. Anderson's boarding house, which was right across the alley from the Broadway Church of Christ. 1512 Broadway was Mrs. Anderson's address, and of course the Church of Christ has been moved down the street west now, several blocks, and the First National Bank Pioneer Building is on that entire block that the church and this boarding house sat on. In fact, the front door of the bank is not very far from where my bedroom was in Miss Anderson's boarding house. Lubbock was just a big overgrown country town at that time. Nobody had any money and didn't make very much. Didn't have much to spend. Autobiography and I'd go on a date, and we'd spend a nickel apiece and get on a bus and ride that thing as far as it went, and then maybe go around the second time. We might get out and walk from town to Tech, and if we really had a little extra money, we'd buy some malted milk apiece or go to a show or something like that. But we just didn't have much money, and we had to figure out ways to entertain ourselves without spending a lot of money. But youth being as it is, we managed to keep ourselves entertained. But anyway, I was working for Mr. Hodges, and we decided to get married in the Palace Theater. And we did. On June the 9th, 1938, we were married. We rented a room at over on 9th Street, I believe, 9th or 10th Street in the 23 or 2400 block, I forget now for sure, upstairs. Just a room, furnished room, and then we were going to take our meals at Mrs. Anderson's boarding house, which was down in the 1500 block on Broadway. And I was working at Hodges Brothers, which was on Avenue G between Broadway and Main Street. So, and our only means of transportation was walking. So we'd get up early and walk to breakfast each morning, 10 or 12 blocks at least, maybe more. Then I would walk on to work from there, and Harbor Faye would walk on back to the rooming house, and for she didn't work for the first few weeks of her marriage at least. I don't know how she spent the time, but I guess she did. But that was a pretty skimpy way of living, but it was kind of living like a king and queen to us at that time. We got tired of this arrangement pretty soon, however, and in the meantime, Mrs. Eklund had moved her boarding house over to about the 15 or 1600 block on Avenue M. She had a nice house, so we rented a room from her and got a room and board there from her. And in the meantime, Mr. Hodges, who had been paying me $12 a week, had raised me to $15 a week when I got married. But after a few weeks at this rate, he decided he couldn't afford that. He told me he was going to cut me back to 12 again. About this time, Mr. and Mrs. Jones and their family asked us to go with them on a trip to the Rio Grande Valley. Mr. Jones' stepmother and half-brother lived in the valley at that time, and they wanted us to go with them. Well, since my wages were fixing to be cut anyway, I decided just well have a vacation while we could, so we went. And when we got back off of this trip, before I went back to work, I did a little inquiring around and found that J.C. Penney Company in Clovis, New Mexico, were looking for a fellow to work for them, and I had heard that this was a pretty good company to work for, so I also heard that they had a job open in Plainview. I found all this out by inquiring at their Lubbock store. In the meantime, my father had moved to Plainview also. So I didn't have any luck at Plainview, and I didn't have an opening in Lubbock, so I hitchhiked to Clovis and got the job. So my dad moved us to Clovis in the back of his car. Everything we had was in the back seat of his old 38.5 Chevrolet. We moved to a little furnished apartment in Clovis, and boy, that was really something for us, because all we'd ever had since we'd been married was just a room in a rooming house. So Harbor Faye got to start cooking. We'd eaten in rooming houses up till this time too. Well, I stayed with J.C. Penney Company in Clovis, New Mexico for 4 years. We lived in this little apartment for a while, and we moved to another one on Meriwether down the street a little ways. Lived there for a while. I believe our landlord's name was Stevens at this place. And on Sunday afternoons, we'd spend our time walking from looking at apartments for rent, and every once in a while we'd find one. And we lived in our 4 years in Clovis in several different places, but most of our time was spent in a house at, I believe it was 510 East Grand Avenue, which was owned by some folks I'd known in Bovina. Byron Turner and his wife, who had been Velvet years before they married. And we rented half of this house, lived in half of it. We rented the whole house most of the time, lived in half of it, and rented the other half out. In the meantime, we finally bought some second-hand furniture on a credit and got it all paid for. And I don't know how we did it, but we managed to get by. And back in these days, as I said, the things were a lot different now. I started to work for J.C. Penney at $60 a month. After 4 years, I believe I was making $100 or $110 a month, which wasn't too bad in those days, although it wasn't real good either. We still didn't have a car. We couldn't afford a car. Our first baby was born in September of 1939. We married in June of 38. And Vance came along, and we still didn't have a car, but we bought a little stroller to push him around in, and we'd walk to town, and we'd buy our groceries and carry them home, and we got along without a lot of things that are considered absolute necessities these days. And we were very happy. We were very much in love. We were young, good health. We had each other and our baby, and we had a happy life, even though we were poor. In the meantime, war clouds began to gather before we left there. But before this, Delvin came along 2.5 years after Vance, and sometime during that period, Arbifay's brother Jack came and lived with us for a few months and went to school in Clovis. His parents, Arbifay's father and mother, had separated, divorced. His mother had moved to Lubbock, and Dad, after a period of time, remarried Naoma Stevenson. Still lived on the farm. And the working hours for pennies were just about as bad, about the same as they had been for Cress's. I worked from 7:30 in the morning. We opened at 8. We got there at 7:30. We closed at 6, and we usually got away about 6:30. We had to sweep the floors before we left, clean up the store, and straighten out the stock. We made friends there. Otto Captina was one of the fellows that worked in the store. And D. Witherspoon and Bill Bomer was the manager. Hall Easterling was one of the fellows that I remember working with. We were all scattered at World War II, and I don't know what's happened to most of them since then. Bill Bomer, I think, has a ranch out of Clovis now, and Otto Captina has probably retired by now. I'm sure he would probably be old enough to. And I don't know what's happened to the rest of them. D. Witherspoon's a store manager somewhere, the last I heard. And Hall Easterling, during the war, went to work for a shipyard as a welder, and I don't know what. I haven't heard of him since the war. But it was during this time that we met Perry and Priscilla Morris and Carl and Betty Tipton, and made some friends who have been lifelong friends and still are. We saw Perry and Priscilla just about a month ago when we visited in California. They live in San Diego. Carl and Betty divorced after the war, but Betty has remarried. Her name is Cravey now, and we see her, or hear from her at least, every Christmas. And it's been several years, I guess, since we've seen her now. But life was good back then. Although wages were low, prices were still low. I could buy a good suit of clothes for $14.95, as good as you can buy for $100 now. Best suit Penny's had was not too much higher than that. Under $30, I think. Unless you bought a tailor-made one. You get a tailor-made one for $30, $35. It was in Clovis that the war clouds began to gather, and I registered for the draft there. We were living there when the war with Japan started, Pearl Harbor. It was there that I went to a riveting school at the airport that the government started to train people for defense work after the war started. We had blackouts, we had rationing, had to have coupons to buy sugar and this and that and the other, and a lot of red tape, but that kept prices down. They had the ceiling prices on everything, the OPA. Roosevelt was president, and he's from Hoover to through Roosevelt. It seemed like it covered half of my lifetime at that time. It seemed to me like Roosevelt was president most of my younger days. He was elected when Hoover went out, and I was just a kid in grade school, and he was president until the day before I was liberated from a prisoner of war camp in Germany in World War II. I believe he died on April the 12th, and I believe I was liberated on April the 13th. I guess those were the good old days, but there was a lot of things about them that was good, but there's a lot of things about them that's much better now, the way we do things now. Anyway, World War II came on, and it just changed everything up. We had, as I said, we had rationing. We also had gasoline rationing and tires, and that didn't affect us at that time because we didn't have a car. My father, during this time, had moved to Farwell, Texas. He worked for a while for the American National Insurance Company on a debit. And it was during this period that I bought a little nickel policy on Delvin and one on Vance, and I've still got them. And I hope I have them for the next 100 years and don't have to use them. But things were getting tighter, the war was getting hotter, and they were drafting people. Looked like they might going to be ready to draft me. I was 24 years old, 24 in Clovis before I left there. So I finished this riveting school. I was an aircraft riveter. I knew how to use a rivet gun. I was qualified to work in an airplane factory. So me and a fellow named Hez Abernathy, who had a used car lot in Clovis, went to Wichita, Kansas to look for us a job in an airplane factory so we wouldn't be drafted. And we found a job at Beach Aircraft Company in Wichita. Well, Hez didn't stay with them long. He worked 2 or 3 weeks and came back to Clovis to see about some business and never did come back to Wichita. But I hung on, and after 3 or 4 weeks, I hadn't been out there very long until I found a place to live in a little apartment in El Dorado, Kansas. And I was sent for my family, who had been living with my mother and father in Farwell while I had gone to Kansas to go to work in an airplane factory. And it was a happy day for me when they arrived in Kansas. I met them at the depot in Wichita, and then a fellow named John Adams who lived in El Dorado and who I was going to ride to work with during this time. Still didn't have a car. Took us all to El Dorado when they got off the train. And never will forget when they got off the train. Here come little old Vance. He was, I guess 2.5, 3 years old maybe. About 3, and he had a big straw hat that, of course, it wouldn't fit in a suitcase. The only way you could carry anything like that would be to wear it, and he was wearing it. And he looked just as cute as a bug in a rug when he come marching out there in that depot. I never will forget what he looked like with that little hat on. We lived in this little house in El Dorado for a while, and then we moved to another apartment, and this was the most prosperous we'd ever been. I think I was making $28 to $30 a week by then, and just working 40 hours. By this time, they'd found out about the 40-hour week or the airplane factory had, I guess because the union had found them. And Beechcraft had a kind of a unique way of paying their employees. They didn't pay them as much by the hour to start with as Boeing and Cessna did, but they had what they called a BEIP, Beach Employees Incentive Plan. And every 3 months, that company would figure out how much profit they'd made during that 3-month period. And it was pretty good back during the war. Of course, they were making airplanes just as fast as they could. The government would buy them. And they'd take half of those profits, just exactly half of them, and divide them among the employees. And your percentage of that pot was the same as your ratio to the your paycheck was to the entire payroll. But in other words, usually the bonus, which was paid quarterly, half in cash and half in government bonds, usually amounted to over half of what we had been paid for that 3 months. Well, that became a pretty substantial amount, and it was about the only way we would have saved any money, but we did save a few bucks during this time. In fact, we bought our first car while we lived in El Dorado, Kansas. It was a second-hand 1936 Ford four-door sedan. Boy, it was a pretty one, dark blue. It used a bucket of oil every time you'd go around the block when we bought it, but I had new rings put in it, new rod inserts, and it ran like a new one from then on as long as I had it. I paid $300 for that thing, and that was a lot of money back in those days, considering the fact that it probably sold for not over $700 or $800 brand new. But finally, we decided we wanted to buy us a house, so we bought a little house on Vine Street. I forget the number now. And it was a 2-bedroom and a kitchen and a living room, just a little old frame house, and didn't amount to much, but it was the first one we'd owned, and we thought it was pretty good at that time, and we got along real well in it, and we had furniture in it. My grandmother and grandfather had lived in Atlanta, Kansas when we moved to Kansas, and they were, during this period of about a year, I guess, before they left there, pretty close, and we saw them very frequently and really enjoyed that because my grandmother and my grandfather Smith were always just like mother and father to me, and I loved them very dearly, and it was mutual. And they were crazy about our kids, and they were crazy about my wife, too, and rightly so. So World War II was on. We're working in a defense factory in Wichita, Kansas, living in El Dorado. And again, those were the good old days, I guess. Life was good. For a while, I worked on Saturdays for J.C. Penney in Wichita when we weren't working on Saturdays at the factory, which we usually didn't because they had to pay us overtime for that. And although they needed those airplanes, they didn't need them bad enough to pay overtime to get them, it didn't seem like. But the war kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter. I worked there for 2 years, I believe. And it began to look like I was going to be drafted in spite of the fact that I was working in a defense factory. I forget how old I was, but I still was, I guess I was probably 23 when I first came to Kansas and left Clovis. I'm sure I was. I was 19 when I married and lived in Clovis 4 years. That'd make 23, wouldn't it? So I was 23 years old when we came to Kansas, and which 2 years later, I was up there 2 years. I was inducted in the Army because World War II was hot. I'd bought this car, and it didn't have very good tires on it. All you could buy then were recaps, and they were terrible. And I didn't drive it to work. I still rode to work in a carpool, John Adams. Paid him so much a week. I forget how much I paid him now, $2 or $3 a week to ride to work. It was 35 miles from El Dorado to Wichita where we worked. We had to be at work and punched in and working by 7 o'clock in the morning, but we got off at 3:30 in the afternoon. We had 30 minutes off for lunch and 2 10-minute or 15-minute breaks maybe during the day. The war kept getting hotter and hotter, and it began to look like, sure enough, they were going to draft me. And we went back to Texas and New Mexico one time while we lived there. We rode the train back, all of us, and then I came back ahead of our buffet and went back to work. But while I was in Clovis, I talked to my draft board, and they told me I just well get ready because it looked like they was going to be calling me up pretty soon. So when I went back to Kansas and our buffet got back, we started kind of winding our affairs up, put our house up for sale, and it sold. We made a few dollars on it, not a lot, but a few. And we got a little apartment in the housing project in Wichita, which was pretty close to where I worked, and stayed there until it. In the meantime, I'd been called to take my pre-induction, what they call my pre-induction physical at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and I wrote my draft board in Clovis. Had arranged for that through the draft board in Wichita because anyway, they couldn't find anything wrong with me. They looked to them like I'd make a good infantry soldier. So I came back and started winding up my affairs again. And I bought a little trailer and sold everything we could, and loaded the kids up, and the car up, and the trailer up, what we had left, and came down to Floydada, Texas. In the meantime, I'd had an induction notice and got it transferred to Floydada, which would postpone it a little while. In fact, what happened was when I got to Floydada, I took it to the draft board there and told them to make arrangements to have my records transferred there so I could be inducted from Floydada instead of from Wichita, Kansas, which they did. And Mr. Jones bought a house in Floydada for his daughter, Arby and Margie, and my sister, Velma, who had married Max Beard by this time. Margie had married Ed Blackwood, and we were all in the service. He bought this house for them to live in Floydada. The address was 629 West Jackson. Vance, I think, started a kindergarten in Floydada while I was overseas, and I was inducted in the Army. And I believe this tape's just about to run out, and I've got a tape on World War II that we're going to let it be a continuation of my life story, starting where this one ends up. And then I'll start on side 4 of those tapes on World War II to continue my life story, and it'll begin after World War II when I was discharged from the Army. So you go from this one to the next tape now. The date is now January the 20th, 1980. It seems like the only time I can get serious about completing this autobiography is at a time when my health was at the worst and the prospects for a long life were not as good as I would like for them to be. When I was discharged from World War II on November the 4th, 1945, my wife was living in Floydada, Texas, in the house her dad had bought, and I had no job or no way of making a living for her and Vance and Delvin. I came back to Floydada and went down to the Chevrolet place, Odin Chevrolet, and got a job as an apprentice body man. I thought I might like to be a body repairman in an automobile dealership. This didn't last long. For one thing, it didn't hardly pay enough to live on. For another thing, when the first holiday came along, which was Thanksgiving, just a week or so after I'd begun working there, it seems, they told me to come on down at 7 o'clock the next morning. It seems that they didn't close for holidays, and the employees worked holidays the same as they did any other day. And I told them I believed that I'd just find myself another job. About this time, I heard of a service station in Idlewood, which was for sale. My father had one in Muleshoe, which he had been running during the war, and it had made him a living, and that's about all. But he and I had talked some about going in business together, and
I had the ambition, didn't have any money, and he didn't have a lot of ambition or money either, but anyway, we checked into this place that I knew and found out that we could buy it for about $800. That would be the inventory that they had at that time. So Dad furnished the money, and half of which I made a note to him for, and owed him for. And we went into business there as partners for the first 3 or 4 weeks of operation. I ran the place by myself because Dad had to dispose of his place in Muleshoe and make arrangements to move to Lubbock. At this time, antifreeze was still scarce, tires were still very scarce, gasoline was selling for 18 cents for regular and 20 cents for ethanol. We had 4 cents a gallon profit in it. But I started out in business running the serving station. And my dad was with me after the first 3 or 4 weeks. We kept the place open from about 7 o'clock in the morning until about midnight at night, and picked up a lot of business off the highway in this manner. And we tried to give as good a service as we could and make as many friends around Idlewild as we could. And although we didn't set the woods on fire with the amount of business we did, we certainly put the other service stations in town to washing windshields, because when anyone came into our place, we washed the windshield, checked the tires, did those things which were free, but which we felt like would bring the customer back. Since the war just ended, servicemen were just getting their discharge. I was the first one out in our family. Dad and I went into operating the station in Idlewild. Bruce was still in the Air Force, Army Air Force, and JF had been sent to Japan in the occupation army. I hadn't seen JF since before the war, or Bruce either for that matter. Bruce got discharged not too long after we came to Idlewild, and Dad and I felt that we wanted to help him as much as we could in any way we could, so another service station about a block and a half down the street east on the highway came up for sale, and we found that we could buy it for about $400 or $500 or $600, I think maybe $500. And so we did buy it at about the time Bruce was due back, so that we would have enough of business to keep the 3 of us employed. Well, Bruce came back and came to Idlewild, and after about a week, he went over to Clovis, New Mexico, to the air base over there, and secured a job. I'm not sure whether it was civil service or not, working in the control tower, which is the same type of work he had done in the Air Force. So Dad and I were stuck with 2 service stations and only 2 of us to run them, and each one a full job for 2 persons. Dad got a little panicky and a little worried. We wanted to kind of make a distress sale and sell it to whoever made a bid and get out from under it, and I kind of wanted to hold out and try to make a few dollars on it. We ran an ad in the Lubbock paper, and one Sunday afternoon, we stayed closed on Sunday morning, but we would open up on Sunday afternoon. A man came over from Lubbock and answered the ad and looked at the place, and I sold it to him for, I believe, $900 that afternoon. And Dad couldn't hardly believe it when he came to relieve me later the day, that because he had felt like we'd be lucky if we got $300 out of it. But anyway, we came out smelling like a rose on that deal. After a fairly short time driving back and forth from Florida to we moved into the little house on the alley behind our place, mother's place, at 1408 Avenue M, and just a little 2-room shack, and we lived in it for a while until we could rent a house out at Idlewild, which we eventually did. This was a farmhouse, which is about a mile south of the town, I guess a half a mile south of the schoolhouse, where the schoolhouse was at that time, belonged to a man, I believe, whose name was Miller.
And by this time, of course, our youngest son, Wayne, was well along on his way. So we moved out to the country, and I bought a bicycle to ride back and forth to the station on. And since that was a pretty good exercise for me, it didn't take long to ride in, and that left the car for Autobiography, who might need it at any time. And we lived this way for a while, until one day Arbor Fay had come to the station to pick me up and take me home for lunch. And Vance and Delvin were in the car. No, I don't believe Vance and Delvin were in the car. I guess Delvin may have been, but Vance probably was at school. Anyway, as we started to cross the intersection of the road in front of the school and another street to the intersection there, we saw a car coming from my left. There were no signs. Legally, I had the right of way since I was a car on the right, but it didn't seem to help much. I throwed on the brakes and turned west to try to keep from a direct impact on the other car. But we wound up in a pretty bad wreck. Our car was laying on its side in the ditch, me halfway in, halfway out. I kept being crushed by the fact that I was in the ditch. Arbor Fay was on top of me, and I believe Delvin. As I've said before, Arbor Fay was pregnant with Wayne, and he was still maybe not due for another 60 days, something like that. But I managed to get out of the car by crawling out under the ditch, and was trying to get Arbor Fay out. But I had a broken collarbone and 2 or 3 cracked ribs, and was unable to do much maneuvering around. And I could hear the gasoline coming out of the gas tank on the car, and was worried that it might catch a fire. But some people got there right quick and helped Arbor Fay and Delvin out. And I was the only one who was injured. Of course, Arbor Fay was shaken up and scared, but there were no problem with the unborn baby, which we thank the Lord. Anyway, I wound up in the Lubbock Hospital for a couple of days. Lubbock Memorial Hospital, which was located on Broadway at about between avenues L and M. And after a couple of days there, I decided I couldn't afford their rates, and since I was a veteran, I was transferred to the Veterans Hospital in Amarillo and stayed there for probably a couple of weeks till I got well enough to where I could sort of maneuver myself around, and I felt like I needed to be home because Arbor Fay was there along with the 2 kiddos, and she being pregnant at the time. Of course, we had no automobile. It had been torn up in the wreck. So I signed myself out of the hospital and came on in. The doctors sort of recommended, and incidentally, while I was in Amarillo, they had done some x-rays on my back, which was hurting because of an old war injury that I think I told about in my World War II story to the grandchildren, and found that I had a cracked vertebrae, and they recommended that I find a line of work that wouldn't be quite as physical as operating a service station. So after some while, I was invited by a fellow named Jess Clarkson, who was assistant superintendent of the American National Insurance Company, to go to work for them. My dad had worked for them at one time in Farwell. I'd been offered a job when I was in Clovis to work for him, but hadn't been interested at that time, and put Dad onto it, and he did work for him for a while during the war. He thought this would be a pretty good job for me. He thought I would have an aptitude for that type of work and probably do well in it. And so on his advice, I accepted the job and went to work for the American National Insurance Company. I did have an aptitude for it and made a pretty good living. We moved to Lubbock. We bought a home in Lubbock in 1947, I believe. brand new house. The address of this new house was 2428 32nd Street. We kept it for several years and finally sold it for $14,500. However, I was talking about my work with the American National. I worked as an agent on a debit for a year and a half, maybe something like that, and a vacancy came open for staff supervisor, so I was promoted to staff supervisor, which is, I believe they called it assistant superintendent at that time. I had 5 men working under me, and did fairly well at that. Then they split the territory up, and I took a staff detached in Brownfield, Texas. Moved down there and put the kids in school in 1948, I believe it was. A little while after we moved, got the kids started in school, it was time for our company convention in Galveston, Texas. And I had qualified for the convention. The company paid my way and our pays way to go down to the convention, which we did. It was not our first one, we'd been there before. But while there, I was asked if I would be interested in taking a promotion to regional supervisor, which would be in the eastern division of the company, east of the Mississippi, working under a fellow named Leo Sexton, who would be the regional manager. I thought about it a little bit and told them yes, I believe I would be interested, so they promoted me. And I had to stay down there when Arbay and they would go down with Walter Kriders that year in our car, and Arbay and Kriders came back. And I stayed for another week for some special training and then came home for a few days and then drove my car back to Birmingham, Alabama, where we conducted a school for managers in a new program that we were putting in at that time. I moved my family in 1949. I believe it was 1948, to Huntsville, Alabama, and stayed there until I believe about the 1st September 1949, when I was made the manager in Orlando, Florida, and I moved the family to Orlando then. And we lived in Orlando until August of 1952, at which time we moved to Jacksonville, Florida. We found Orlando, Florida to be a very nice place to live, although it seemed strange to us that people came in and out so much. We bought a house in Orlando at number 30 Stymie Place, and I think by the time we'd been there 6 months, we were nearly the oldest people on the block. People just keep moving all the time out there, it seemed like. We like to live in Florida, and we like the climate, but I really didn't care a lot for my work. I was the manager of a small district and had 2 staff supervisors and about 10 or 12 agents. We were not permitted to write these different types of insurance there that we could in Texas, so the fellows had a little harder time selling insurance. I had a hard time keeping men on the debits. The manager's contract wasn't very good. It just was pretty hard for me to make enough to live on. So in 1952, I responded to an advertisement in the Jacksonville paper to interview a fellow who was down in Orlando looking for some people to be adjusters for Motors Insurance Corporation, which was a subsidiary of General Motors. It was kind of amusing. One of my agents answered the same ad, and he wondered what I was doing there, and of course I knew what he was doing there. He wasn't making a living selling insurance, and I didn't blame him, but I didn't encourage him too much. Anyway, there were about 80 or 85 of us answered that advertisement out of the whole shooting match. I was the only one they hired. So on August the 2nd, I believe it was, 1952, I went to work for Motors Insurance Corporation as an adjuster trainee in Jacksonville, Florida. We moved to Jacksonville and stayed there until the following February. At this time I was put on the key point in Fitzgerald, Georgia. So we moved from Jacksonville to Fitzgerald, Georgia, and we found this little southern town to be a real nice place to live. We made some lasting friendships there. Our landlord was a fellow named I.B. Johnson. We also became acquainted with and learned to love and appreciate Cliff and Thelma Pickens, who were pretty close to our age, perhaps a little bit older. Cliff was the assistant postmaster in Fitzgerald, and they were a nice family. They had 3 boys and no girls. We took 1 or 2 vacation trips with Pickens, using our car and a company car and a little 2-wheel trailer we had made, and went to the Smoky Mountain National Park and camped out. Just had a ball of the time. It was while we were at Fitzgerald that Vance took a great interest in scouting, and I believe went about as high as he could, with the one exception maybe. And he also developed an interest in pictures, photography. I bought him a little darkroom set and a camera, and he developed some of his own pictures. And in later life became very good at it. Delvin did real well in Fitzgerald. She was always a good girl and a good student. She won the citizenship award, I think, a time or 2 in her class. And Wayne was in school in Fitzgerald and did very well. He and I.B. Johnson were pretty big buddies. So altogether, our stay in Fitzgerald was a happy time. In September of 1955, Schuyler Floyd, who was my claim manager, told me he wanted to make a claim supervisor and give me a promotion. So it became necessary for us to move back to Jacksonville, and I took on the responsibilities of being a claim supervisor for MIC. We bought a house out in the Arlington section, I believe it's 7629 Grape Avenue. We moved there, and they changed it. Grape Avenue to Galveston Avenue later on. We lived in this place nearly 4 years. Being a claim supervisor had its advantages and its disadvantages. It paid a little more, which was good. You weren't supervised quite so closely, which was good. But it was a job that required me to do a lot of traveling. I usually left home on Monday morning and came in Friday night because my adjusters that I supervised, nearly all of them detached adjusters, key point adjusters we called it, who lived away from Jacksonville. So northern Georgia and southern Florida became my territory as a claim supervisor. I had a man in Albany, Georgia, 1 in Tallahassee, Florida, and 2 in Orlando, Florida, and so you can see they were really scattered around. And I put a lot of miles on the company cars. MIC was a good company to work for. They had very good fringe benefits. They furnished us a car that we would use for our personal use, just by paying the operating costs while we were using it for our personal use. And their fringe benefits and the employee benefits are just unequaled by nearly any other company. But I found that you really had to earn them too. You gotta go when you work for General Motors, and you gotta stay on the go all the time. You never catch up. If you do, well, they probably wouldn't need you. After a couple of years of this claim supervisor driving around like this, I got the boss, who at that time was Teal Cool, to let me and Stacy Coggins, who was subrogation supervisor, which was an inside job, switch jobs. So I went inside the office in Jacksonville as a subrogation supervisor, and Stacy Coggins took my place out in the field as a claim supervisor. The pay was the same, except I did lose my company car, but I knew I would when I asked for the switch, and I thought that was a pretty small price to pay for being able to be at home every night. It was while we were living here in Jacksonville I really became, for the first time in my life, very seriously interested in the Lord's work. We went to church at the Arlington Church of Christ in the Arlington section of Jacksonville. While I was there, they asked me to be a deacon, and I served as a deacon for probably a year and a half before we 2.5 or 3 years, I guess, before we moved back to Texas. This injury from World War II to my back had got to where it gave me more and more trouble all along. There had been times when I was in Fitzgerald that I just couldn't work. I had to miss a few days' work because of my back. There had been a few nights that I couldn't even go to bed because I couldn't get comfortable laying in bed and had sat up in a chair, twisted around in all kinds of positions trying to ease the pain. Anyway, for supervisory personnel, MIC has a program where they paid for a complete physical examination for you every year and insisted on you taking it. And in the course of the second one of these I took, the doctor who was making the examination suggested that there were things that could be done for my back, that I should probably see an orthopedic specialist, which I did. I saw Dr. Mead. He made x-rays, a myelogram, and told me he thought he could stop my trouble. It was a double spine fusion, which was a rather serious operation, and a fairly new one that he had pioneered with much success, however. And I agreed that since that's what they recommended, and they thought it would do me so much good, that that's what we'd do. I had good insurance coverage with MIC, one of the fringe benefits that you can't hardly beat. So on my 40th birthday, on May the 8th, 1959, I spent 8 hours on the operating table. And Dr. Mead and a nerve specialist, Dr. Chandler, I believe his name was, did a double spinal fusion on my back. They fused 3 vertebrae together by using some bone that they took from my right hip bone. Dr. Mead was right. It stopped my back trouble. No longer have any back problems at all. In the meantime, Vance had graduated from high school in 1954, I believe it was, in Jacksonville, and had gone to down to Tampa to Florida Christian College. We'd finally persuaded him that it'd be better if he had some college education before he started to get out and try to make a living. And our buffet and I became concerned about our parents. My parents were getting old. Lived in Oklahoma. Dad had retired. He had epilepsy by this time. Mr. Jones had emphysema and heart trouble, and he was getting older, and we just felt like we would like it better if we lived close enough that we could see either sets of parents on short notice frequently if we wanted to, and could get there on short notice in case of sickness. So when I came back to work after this spinal fusion operation, I asked my bosses, Hardy Ralston was the manager there by this time, about transferring me back to Texas. Actually, what I asked for was a transfer to the Oklahoma City branch. I felt like if I could get anywhere within that Oklahoma City territory, I would be close enough to my parents or Blade's parents. We could get there on short notice if needed. Well, in looking over my records, they saw that I lived in Lubbock, Texas a long time and married here, so they thought, well, that'd be the logical place to send him back. They wanted to be close to home. So they transferred me back to Lubbock, Texas, and I came back as a senior adjuster with no cut and pay from subrogation supervisor and started handling claims in Lubbock, Texas. Vance had dropped out of college by this time. He was working for Prudential Insurance Company and had a girlfriend in Jacksonville. He thought he was going to want to marry. He later changed his mind about Christmas time in 1959, maybe the 1st of January 1960. He did come back with us, moved back to Lubbock, and enrolled in Lubbock Christian College. Went there one semester. He didn't make very good grades, and before he ever got back in school again, he had decided to marry, and he and Charlene had married. He was working at a grocery store at the time they married. Delvin graduated from high school in 1960 in Lubbock, Texas. In spite of the fact that she had just moved back, which always upset your school year, though, she finished on the honor roll. Delvin was always a good student. And she then went to college one semester at Abilene Christian College, and the rest of her college work was done at Texas Technological College here in Lubbock. When we moved back, we moved into the house that Arthur Faye's mother had owned. Arthur Faye's mother had died, I believe, in 1947. And the house belonged to Weldon and Jack and Arthur Faye and Margie. And we paid the other three rent and lived there ourselves for a little over a year. After we moved back, the house has been moved now. Jack bought it, moved it out to the edge of town, and parked buses on that property now. And the house burned, I think, a few years ago in a fire out on the edge of town. As I said, Delvin went to school most of her college career at Texas Technological College. Vance had dropped out of college and married and was trying to make a living. And in Lubbock, the Broadway Church of Christ had what they call a Bible chair up near the college campus. College students who are members of the church to have a place to gather for their social gathering, to study, and they had Bible classes there. And Delvin met a young fellow from Dallas named Louis Moncrief at the Bible chair, and they became quite enamored of each other and married, I believe, a little while before. Well, about the time Delvin got out of college, a little before she got out of college, maybe. I can't remember for sure right now. Anyway, she got a year ahead of Louis. They went to Michigan after Louis graduated. And he worked on his master's degree there and got his master's and his doctorate at Michigan State, and then taught at North Carolina State, lived in Raleigh for a while, come back to Michigan State. He's now a full professor at Michigan State on leave, doing a special research project for the U.S. Forest Service, and they're living in South Carolina, I believe, at this time. Seemed like there's something about working for General Motors that makes it hard for you to keep healthy. In 1961, I was still having what I thought were back problems from that operation, but it turned out that it wasn't. It turned out to be a kidney stone, my left kidney, and so I had to go into the hospital in 1961 and have that kidney stone removed from the kidney by having an incision made in my side. Then again in 1965, I developed the same problem in the same place, another big kidney stone, left kidney. And this time they found that it was embedded so badly and had destroyed so much tissue around it that I was telling about my health problems, and as I said, in 1965 they went into my left kidney again to try to remove a kidney stone, but found that it had grown to such an extent and destroyed so much tissue that it couldn't be saved. So since that time I've been a one kidney man, which is alright. You really don't need that other one unless the time comes when you need another spare, and you just don't have a spare, so I've not suffered from the loss of that kidney. When I came to Lubbock, a fellow named Arlo Bradshaw was the manager here. I didn't know it at the time, but I was being paid about as much money as he was, and that created a little problem in his mind, since he thought that since he was a manager he certainly should be making more, and I think he might have been right. However, after having known him
as well as I did for as long as I did. I don't really think he is worth any more. He had been promoted just a little bit above his capabilities, and that really made life difficult for me because he delighted in picking my work to pieces. That was his way of showing himself and the company, I guess, that he was better than I am. Anyway, working for MIC, over a period of years, it became a pretty big problem. I got a little overweight. I had been a heavy cigarette smoker since I started when I was 10 or 12 years old. I did quit smoking cigarettes on the 4th of July, 1967, and stayed with a pipe and nothing but a pipe until September the 8th, 1968, at which time I had a very, very serious heart attack. In the meantime, Delvin and Lewis were in Michigan, had 3 children by this time, I believe. Wayne had married Sharon Watford, who was Lewis's first cousin, and had made a highway patrolman. In fact, he was just a new highway patrolman, I believe, when I had this heart attack. In 1968, prior to the heart attack, Autobiography and I had taken a 4-week vacation. We had bought us a little travel trailer by this time, and we were going to Idaho Falls, Idaho, on a campaign for Christ, where Wayne Emmons, our preacher, was going to be preaching the campaign. Sharon wanted to go with us, our new daughter-in-law, and since Wayne was in training school in Austin with the highway patrol at this time, and we took her along, and we took a month off and really went up through Colorado and into Idaho and Yellowstone, Black Hills. I believe we met Delvin and Lewis in the Black Hills, and came on home. And in the meantime, Wayne Emmons' wife he was our preacher, taken up with a college professor, and he was staying at our house until they got some things settled. I'd been back and the work had really piled up, and they'd switched me to a different territory while I was gone. And I came back and just worked my tail off for about a week. And the following Saturday morning, I had a heart attack, and it was a bad one. It like to got me, I guess. Autobiography got me to the hospital in an ambulance in time, and Dr. Bridwell was there waiting. She'd called him, and I pulled through. But this made quite a change in my life. I haven't smoked anything since then, and the company decided that on the doctor's recommendation that it'd be better if I had an inside job instead of handling claims on the outside like I had been. So they moved me to Oklahoma City so I could have an office job. This was fine. The only thing is the office job didn't pay quite as well. So I did take a pretty good cut in pay when I made that move. But that would have been all right because I was still making a living. But then in July the 29th, that morning while I was at work, I had another heart attack hit me. I went home and called the doctor, and he met me in the emergency room, and they put me in the hospital, and I stayed there for, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And then after I'd kind of recovered from that, went back in, had an angiogram made, and found out that there was quite extensive damage in there, and the recommendation was that I retire and quit work, and that's what I did. After a little more than a year after I'd quit work, we decided we'd rather live in Lubbock than Oklahoma City, so we packed up everything, sold our house in Oklahoma City, bought one in Lubbock, and moved back here. And this
in the house that we still live in now. We moved into this house Christmas week 1970, and I'm making this tape at right now it's midnight, Monday the 21st, Sunday night, in other words. So it's actually Monday morning right now. When Dr. Bressey made the angiogram in Oklahoma City, he found that one of my arteries was completely stopped up, and that portion of my heart vessel, which it fed, was destroyed with this scar tissue left. My arteries seemed to be clogged up pretty bad with cholesterol, but it was felt that if I started by taking moderate exercise, walking, and gradually increased it, that probably collateral circulation would build up, and I'd have a fairly normal expectancy as long as I did a lot of resting and didn't do too much. So this procedure I followed. I did get to playing racquetball with Albert Grigsby, who's 10 years older than I am, 11 years older than I am, I guess. So we didn't ever overdo it, but I did get good exercise, but in the last 6 to 8 weeks, I have noted that it seemed like I got tired quicker than I should. And I woke up a few times at night with a little short of breath, and I started having some pains that I felt like were from my heart on the right side of my upper part of my chest, the middle part. So I saw Dr. Bridwell and asked for an angiogram, and he sent me to Dr. King, who is a heart specialist. The angiogram was made last Friday, and it was found that another one of my arteries was now completely occluded, and the two remaining ones are between 80 and 90% stopped up. And my only hope of living very much longer would be a bypass operation. So I expect to hear from Dr. King sometime tomorrow when the operation is scheduled, and go back into the hospital and have this operation. This has covered a lot of territory in a pretty short time. In the last few minutes of this tape here, but I might fill in some of the vacant spaces. In 1959, when we did move back to Lubbock from Jacksonville, Florida, where I had been very active in the church, we started going to church first at the Southside congregation here in Lubbock. We bought a house in 1961 over on 38th Street, 5105 38th Street, and when we made that move, we decided we'd move our church home, and we came to Vandalia Village. Bob Hoover was a preacher at that time, and he was a good one. In 1964, we were still going to Vandalia, and they asked me to serve as an elder at that place, and I agreed. So in the fall of 1964, I was installed as an elder and remained in this job until 1969, when I had to move to Oklahoma City because of my transfer after my heart attack. When I moved back to Lubbock in 1970 at Christmas time, they asked me along in the middle of 1971 if I would serve again as an elder. I agreed. And I was installed again at that time. A few years later, and I'm not just exactly sure when it was, I think it might have been 78, and or the latter part of 77, I resigned the eldership again. I felt like at that time that that would be the best thing for me to do under the circumstances. And but this past March in '79, they asked me would I serve again, and after a lot of thought and prayer, I agreed to do so. And I'm still serving as an elder in Vandalia now. We live now at 2118 68th Street in a nice house that is completely paid for. I had some reservations about retirement, even though it was a disability retirement, because of the reduced income I felt like I would have, but the Lord has been very good to me. And I find that each year since I've been retired, my income has been greater than it was the year before, including the first year I retired. The first year I was retired, my income was greater than it had been the last year in which I'd worked. The Lord has taken care of me very well, and I have every confidence that He'll see me through this operation this coming week. If He doesn't, anyone listening to this tape, I'd like to have you know that I face death with no fears. I have sinned greatly in my life, but I believe I've been forgiven. And I believe that no matter what your sins might be, whoever's listening, they'll be forgiven if you'll change your ways and ask for forgiveness. That's what the Lord requires. Our family's rather large now compared to what it used to be. Vance and Charlene live in Buena Park, California. They, at this time, both work for the post office. Vance is a letter carrier in Anaheim, and Charlene is a clerk in some post office 15 or 20 miles from where they live. Their oldest child and my oldest grandchild, Michelle, is 18 years old now and a senior in high school and has plans to be a registered nurse. She's a real sweet girl, and we love her very much. Vance's next child is Jason. Jason spent some time with us this summer. He went to North Carolina with us. I baptized Jason myself when he was here this past summer, and I understand that he's doing excellent in school this year, and that he's making the Dean's Honor Roll many times, and it just pleases me no end to know that he's doing this well, and I'm real proud of Jason. Their youngest girl is Allison. Allison was with us this summer as Jason was. She's a very sweet girl, and we love her very much. And we regret that we haven't been able to be around Allison as much in her young life as we were with Michelle and Jason when they were growing up, because ever since Allison nearly has been born, they've lived in California, and that's quite a ways from Lubbock, Texas. So we really haven't seen each other as often as we did Jason and Michelle. Delvin has, her oldest son is Whit, who was adopted here in Lubbock. He's a good boy. He and Jason are just about the same age. I believe they're three months difference in their ages. One's birthday is on September 28th, and the other one's on November 28th. So I guess there's just 2 months difference, isn't there? And then after Whit, there's Lori Lynn, who is adopted and a very sweet little girl. And then there's Danny and Amy. So Delvin has 4, all nice, sweet children. Wayne and Sharon. Wayne has been with the Highway Patrol now since 1968, which is 12 years, I believe. He's in the Motor Vehicle Inspection Division, living in Pasadena, which is a suburb of Houston. He has 2 boys, Rex, who was the New Year's baby, I believe, in 1970 in Kilgore, Texas. He was the first baby born that year in Kilgore. And then Troy is the next grandson, and he's a fireball and a crackerjack. My pet name for him for a long time was my red-headed ringtail tutor, and that pretty well describes him. He's a real fine boy and is full of life and vim, vigor, and vitality. He right at this time, he doesn't like to be reminded he has red hair, but I like his red hair. I think it's becoming to him, and as long as it doesn't indicate a temper that he can't control, he'll be all right. I just feel like our family and I have been real well blessed with some fine children and great-grandchildren, not great-grandchildren, children and grandchildren. And I hope I do live long enough to see great-grandchildren too. I think that'd be real fine. As I said a while ago, Lewis is a college professor on leave of absence right now, working at Clemson University on a research program for the United States Forest Service, I believe. Lewis and Delvin own a farm in Michigan near Haslett. I believe 88 acres perhaps, with a good, nice, large house on it. And Lewis is a full professor, and he told me not long ago that he'd had a bigger raise than he ever thought he'd get. So the Lord seems to be blessing them materially as well as spiritually, and for that we're very thankful. We're living in troubled times. Within the last 2 weeks, we've seen gold jump in price, 2 or 3 or 4 weeks at least. We've seen gold jump in price from around $4 to $4.50 an ounce to $8.50 an ounce. Silver's gone up close to $50 an ounce. Everything is just higher than a kite. Gasoline is short. The country of Iran is keeping some Americans hostage in our embassy over there. They've had a revolution over there. The anarchy seems to be reigning in that place at this time. Russia has just invaded Afghanistan, and the war clouds seem to be gathering again. It is my prayer and my fervent hope that we will not have to be delivered, that we will not have to be involved in another war. I would hate to think that my grandchildren have to go back and do the same job that I thought we were doing when I was in World War II. I think I'll summarize the family briefly right now. Of the Smiths, my Aunt Allie Smith Groover, is still living. She's at Cookson Hills Christian School in eastern Oklahoma. My Uncle Virgil Smith is still living. At the present time, he's in Brazil attending some business. But it's my understanding he'll be back in the States in a short time to stay probably for the rest of his life. His wife, Gail, is a native Brazilian, but I believe she likes it over here well enough that those plans are in agreement with her, too. Luella, one of my cousins, is Luella Audrey is her name now. She's Uncle Bernard's daughter. Is living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and she would be the next Smith, older than after Virgil and Allie, and then would be me. And then of course Velma and Bruce and JF are all still alive. On the Hatchett side, Aunt Addie and Aunt Vera are the only ones left. My mother and Uncle Jess and Uncle Brown and Aunt Emma, Uncle Fred are all dead. On our Pace side of the family, Mr. Jones, her daddy, is still alive. He just was discharged from the hospital last week. He has some gallbladder problems, and he's somewhat overweight, but they seem to have things under control with medication for him. Weldon is married to Helen, and they farm Mr. Jones' home place. He bought a couple acres and built him a house on it, and the rest of it he rents from his dad and his Aunt Mert. Myrtle and Raj are the only two of the Jones family who are still alive. Marjorie is living in Dallas. That's Arbor sister. She works for GMAC and lives in a house that her son Richard owns and furnishes her rent-free. Her oldest son Ed Jr. lives in Houston, works for the county court system there. Jack, Arbor's youngest brother, still a bachelor, lives here in Lubbock and works for Johnson Manufacturing Company as a welding inspector, I believe his job is. Her Uncle Roy, Tempe, Arizona, died just the other day. Marjorie has 3 children living. Ed Jr., who lives in Houston, Richard, who lives in Alaska, and maybe in Seattle, but now I'm not sure. And Beverly, who's married to Terry Self, lives in Mesa, Arizona, which is a suburb of Phoenix. My sister Velma lives in Tucson, Arizona. My brother Bruce lives in Statesville, North Carolina, and my brother JF lives in Pensacola, Florida. Bruce's kiddos are scattered. JF, his wife is named Doris. She is his second wife, and his 2 oldest children, Stephanie and David Ross, were adopted by Hank Mobley, who Frances married after she left JF. And Jay really doesn't get to see his older children very much, and they don't seem to associate too much together, which is sad. He's deprived of the pleasure of helping bring his grandkids up this way, I guess. My cousin Morris died several years ago with a heart attack. Don Carlos and Hilda Marie and Norma Jean and William Edward, Bill, are the only one of Uncle Earl's children who are alive. Margaret died several years ago with cancer. And Allie has 2 boys, David and Charles, both married. So I guess that accounts for about all the Smith children and the cousins. Perhaps one of these days after my operation is over, and I'll think of some more things to add to this tape, but right now I believe I'll sign off, and I'd like to say that I hope that after I'm gone, if any of my grandchildren or great-grandchildren want a copy of it, that it'll be made available for them from whoever has these tapes in their possession. God bless you, and good night.